Thank you for joining us in our discourse today on Father Alfred Delp. I am your host, Dustin J. Bird, Professor of Philosophy and Religion at the University of Olivet. I'm also the editor-in-chief of Ekperosis Press and the founder and co-director of the Institute of Critical Social Theory. In recent years, through books and films, Americans have come to know about the Protestant minister Dietrich Bonhoeffer as his martyrdom at the hands of the Nazis. What is lesser known are those Catholics who also resisted Nazism and paid the ultimate price for doing so. Among them was Father Alfred Delp, a Jesuit priest from Mannheim who served a community at the end of his life in Bogenhausen, a neighborhood in Munich. Born into a mixed Catholic family, Catholic and Protestant family, his mother being Catholic, his father being Protestant, young Alfred would eventually opt for Catholicism after being rebuffed by a Lutheran pastor who did not take well to his questions. After receiving his first communion, Alfred would later study at the Goetheschule in Dieburg. He would later go on to join the Jugendbund Neudeutschland Catholic youth movement, which was banned in 1933 by the Nazis. In 1926, Alfred joined the Society of Jesus, better known as the Jesuits, a religious order founded by St. Ignatius of Loyola in 1540. After joining the order, Father Delp would continue his studies in Austria, the Netherlands, and Frankfurt, Germany, much of it under the watchful eye of the Nazi regime, which came to power again in 1933. The Nazis were always suspicious of the Jesuits, despite the Reichskonkordat signed by the Nazi regime and the Vatican in 1933. Delp was officially ordained a priest in 1937 in Munich, but because of the University of Munich's rejection of his candidacy for the doctoral program in philosophy, Delp worked as an editor for the Jesuit journal Stimmen der Zeit, or Voices of the Time, which was eventually banned in 1941 as well by the Nazis, again for what they believed was an anti-Nazi sentiment advocated by the Jesuits. Like many, Father Delp stood in opposition to Hitler and the Nazis, seeing fascism as being antithetical to Christianity and Catholicism in particular. Nevertheless, open defiance and/or denunciation of the Nazis resulted in harsh treatment for the Jesuits, including the confiscation of their property, closure of their schools and media outlets, and imprisonment. Nevertheless, Father Delp would eventually join a clandestine group called the Kreisau Circle, which worked to envision a post-Nazi German society, one that would be more in tune with Christian values. Systematically imagining the very idea of the collapse of the Third Reich was enough to herald the charge of treason. But to be associated with Klaus von Stauffenberg's July 20th, 1944 failed attempt to assassinate Hitler would ultimately result in Delp's arrest by the Gestapo. After the failed plot, Hitler commissioned a special Gestapo group to arrest, interrogate, put on trial, and execute all who were involved, no matter in what way they were involved. Having spent months in Berlin's famous Tegel prison, Delp would eventually face the communist-turned-fascist judge Roland Freisler, who conducted his famous show trials, often with hidden cameras filming the proceedings so Hitler could satisfy his lust for vengeance by watching his victims be berated and humiliated by Freisler. For Delp, the trial was a farce. It was aimed at him personally, not because of what he did, but because he was a Jesuit. Although he was offered his freedom if he were to leave the Jesuit order, he refused, which ultimately cost him his life. Delp was executed at Plötzensee prison in Berlin on February 2nd, 1945, one day before an Allied bomb landed on Judge Roland Freisler and killed him. On the orders of Heinrich Himmler, Delp's body, along with the bodies of the other July 20th plotters, were cremated and dispersed among sewage fields near Berlin. Delp's many letters written in prison stand as a testament to what he saw as the need for radical dependence of God, both in turmoil and in tranquility. While Delp has been remembered in Germany with many schools, streets, and chapels named after him, his beatification process began in 1990 with documentation from his final parish being sent to the Archbishop of Berlin for consideration. While this process is ongoing, the West's trouble with authoritarianism and rising fascism is once again impelling us to look at figures like Father Delp for inspiration. To talk about Father Delp, we have with us today Dr. Rudolf J. Siebert. Dr. Siebert is originally from Frankfurt, Germany, and grew up in the Weimar years as well as in the Third Reich. He was recruited as a 15-year-old into the Luftwaffe and later the Wehrmacht, and would eventually be captured and brought to the U.S. as a POW. Having been part of the anti-Nazi Catholic youth movement himself, the American authorities sent him back to Germany to help democratize it. In the early 1960s, he returned to the U.S. to teach at Loyola College in Baltimore, Maryland, and in 1965, he took up a position at the Department of Comparative Religion at Western Michigan University, where he would teach for 54 years. He is the author of over 30 books and hundreds of articles and book chapters, and he is the director of 2 international courses, the Future of Religion course in Dubrovnik, Croatia, and the Religion and Civil Society course in Yalta, Ukraine. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Siebert.
You're welcome.
So with that big, long introduction there, is there anything that you heard that you thought I was missing, a point that would be important to also include in that?
Well, I'm very happy that we can talk about Delp now. After we talked about Bonhoeffer, we are in a similarly turmoil situation like people were 100 years ago. And I don't think we have learned too much from that time. So it is important to remember those who were brave enough to resist fascism. It needs a lot of fortitude to resist a fascist regime because of its threats. And so people are very often fearful. So I'm glad that we can do this today so that we are informed better about what is happening to us.
In our correspondence, in preparation for this discourse, you often said that preparing for it, reading about Delp and the books that we both read about Delp, it reminded you of many of your own experiences. What were those experiences that you remember as we prepared for this?
Well, we were about one generation apart. So Delp joined the Jesuits 1 year before I was born. So that was the distance. But what we had in common, we were both members of the Catholic youth movement, and we were both leaders in the Catholic youth movement. This Catholic youth movement had been part of the Concordat, so between Hitler and the papacy. So it should have been permitted, and it was permitted in the beginning, but then it was forbidden. And my friends, the other leaders, some of them were tortured, some were killed, some were tortured so much that we could not even open up the coffins in the cathedral in Frankfurt. So badly they were taken, were treated. So that what I had in common with him was this leadership in the Catholic youth movement, where not only the movement was forbidden, but of course also any activity. So we both took youth groups into the mountains and had meetings with them, and it was always very dangerous. And our priests were frightened that they would catch us, and so that was the similarity.
So, when did you first hear about Alfred Delp? I mean, as an adult, he was in Munich. You were, as you said, a generation younger in Frankfurt. Did you hear about him while he was still alive, or did that come afterwards?
No, during the Nazi period, nobody really talked about them or mentioned individual names or whatever. That there was a resistance, of course, and that this was discovered, that was known, but the individuals were not mentioned, except, of course, Stauffenberg. So, no, I had no idea. And then I was in Dieburg. I had a house right beside the Goetheschule, where Delp went. And then I taught in the Catholic institution nearby, where he had been there after he converted from Lutheranism to Catholicism. He lived in that Catholic institute nearby. And so, but even during this time, not much was said about Delp or anything thing about the resistance. Masses of people were even still in the end of the war, they were still remembering Hitler, and still had believed up to the end that he would be the only man who could conquer communism. So that was the main issue, that even the Pope or the priests thought that the only man who could protect Germany and Europe from communism was National Socialism. For us, that has been mixed up a little bit in recent decades, so that we always mention both of them together as if they were the same or whatever. In reality, there is no deeper hostility than that between a National Socialist and the socialists, the other socialists and the communists. And so that was a fight of life and death between the two. And not only did Hitler continually fight them in his campaigns and so on, but then he even marched into the Soviet Union in order to wipe out the communists, and then of course also to colonize Russia, as the Europeans always had the tendency, from the Crusaders on through Napoleon to Hitler. Napoleon marched into Moscow with 800,000 people. So, and then Hitler with 4 million people. So Europe is overcrowded and needs territory. And there is this wonderful territory in the East, and it seems not to be cultivated enough. And so it is not used well. And so one has to go there and colonize them. And that was the plan, to colonize Russia, to have a road to St. Petersburg, to Moscow, and to Kiev, and then to settle German farmer soldiers who would have Slavs who would work for them. They would be fed well, would have 2 children each. And so the whole thing was already organized and planned, even in Hitler's Mein Kampf, Hitler's My Struggle, which has come out in a new edition and is bought massively all over the place. So as then, so also today, people are still following Hitler's Mein Kampf. So we are 100 years separate, but there are some similarities. It's not the same today, obviously not, but history does not repeat itself, but there are sometimes similarities. So that, as far as the whole, I know when I grew up, there was always talk about the Russian steamroller and what the Russians could do to us and so on. So, but in reality, of course, the West very often were the attackers.
Yeah, when reading his prison letters and knowing when he was in the Kreisau Circle, that, I mean, obviously he was a critic of Nazism. He was also very much a critic of communism, and the vision that he had, or he was articulating during the Kreisau Circle, was a Germany that was closer to its Christian roots. Obviously, he was not anti-modernistic, but he was certainly critical of modernism, which he saw Nazism and communism both as a form of modernism. And that vision that he had for the post-Nazi Germany, I think, was deeply rooted in his own order of the Jesuit order. And for people who aren't too familiar with the Jesuit order, can you give us a little bit of understanding about what it is, its history, what it was there for, what it's meant to the church?
Well, the Jesuits, you may say, are the smartest people in the church. And from Ignatius of Loyola on, they were counter-Reformation people. They were the carriers of the counter-Reformation. So Europe became almost totally Protestant, but then the Jesuits were able to save the southern part of Europe, the southern part of the Americas for Catholicism. So the counter-Reformation element is important. And they did it in a very intelligent way. So therefore, they are also the somehow the troops of the Pope surrounding the Pope. But it was the first time that with Francis, a Jesuit, went to the throne himself. That always happens in institutions. It is because of the threat to capitalism, which is greater today than ever before, that the people who are in power now came into power. And so it is in the church as well. It was not enough anymore to support the Pope, but the Jesuits had to get into the papacy itself. And so we'll see what happens to this whole experience. But the things in the church are sometimes, the struggles are very similar to those outside. And so the authoritarians are rising, not only in the secular sphere, but in the religious sphere as well. And therefore, this election of the Pope now will be very, very important for the next history of the church.
Yeah, it's not a mystery in history that the Nazis, particularly Hitler, was very aggressive against Christianity. I mean, he saw Christianity as the Bolshevism of the Roman Empire. He talks a lot about it in the table talks, less so in Mein Kampf, more in the table talks. So people who think that Hitler was some kind of believing Catholic. I mean, he was baptized Catholic, but somehow that he left the church intellectually, spiritually in many ways. But he had that aggressiveness towards Christianity. But it seems like there was a particular aggressiveness towards the Jesuits. Do you think it has something to do with this idea that they were the smartest ones in the church, that they could outmaneuver intellectually anyone who would be put in front of them? I mean, what was their hang up with the Jesuits?
Well, Hitler was educated Catholic, so was his wife, Eva Braun. So she was educated by nuns, he was educated by priests. And his relationship to priests was rather ambiguous. So when he was in Vienna and painted and made his living from painting, it was very often priests who bought his paintings and then sold them for him. Also, when he lived in Munich in the 30s, he had priest friends. There was Father Leo, for instance, who was with him and visited him almost daily. So he had contact. When he went to picnics with his party members, he visited Benedictine monasteries very often, and he was fascinated by the relationship between the abbot and the monks, so that the monks all looked like the abbot. And so that became somewhat his ideal for his own castles, where he imitated somehow monasticism. So his father wanted to become a monk, and he himself, Hitler, wanted to become a priest once. So there was a relationship there. So when Father Leo was assassinated by the SS in Munich, when they wiped out the SA leadership in Munich, then Father Leo was killed too, and Hitler ran around and said, "They have killed my dear Father Leo," and so and so. But he also later on, when he could not get along with the church, Catholic Church, he tried to bring Bishop Müller up, Müller of the German Catholic, German Christians, but that he gave up too. Somehow he was fascinated by cardinals in the Catholic Church. They looked like the senators, they looked Roman, and that fascinated him tremendously. So about his attitude toward Catholicism, we have to be very careful. People say he never went to church, but then I have pictures where he comes out of a church. So there was a conflict with the Catholic Church, but it was not always Christianity in general, but it was not total. There was some part of Roman Catholicism which he was fascinated by, and another part, which is the Jewish part, of course, of Catholicism. That is what he argued against, but not on the basis of faith, but in basis of race. In that sense, the Nazi anti-Semitism was very different from the old religious anti-Semitism, which was based on that the Jews had killed Christ, or so on religious motivations. But Hitler's anti-Semitism was not religious any longer, but it was biological, you could say.
Yeah, you can almost see the Nazi image of Jesus, who obviously is Jewish, but has to be somehow rescued by Nazism. That they make him the bastard son of the Roman centurion Pantera, to say that, well, it's only the Jewish side that's bad. He's also an Aryan, which reminds me of how they looked at the church. So the Roman side of the Roman Catholic Church, that which of Rome that it preserved within itself, that's the side that they admired. But like you said, that Jewish side, those teachings of Jesus or whatnot, yeah, that can go.
Yeah, now Hitler thought that Jesus was a great man, that he was a theoretical type of a genius. So he had respect for Jesus' teaching, and particularly for how long his movement lasted, that it was still present after 2,000 years. So he was amazed by that. And then, of course, they tried to make him into an Aryan, and that was to happen that Mary had some kind of a Gallian soldier for her husband, and that is why he became Roman in a certain sense. So it was a crazy type of a construct which they made, but they wanted to rescue some of it. So also Hitler was for Schopenhauer, and he did not like Hegel, but they nevertheless honored Hegel as a great, here we have a statue of him here. He was a great man for Hitler too, in spite of the fact that he followed his arch enemy, namely the thinker Schopenhauer, the father of Western pessimism, metaphysical pessimism. So we have to see when propaganda maybe is very one-sided, we have to see that we see all those people who we consider maybe our opponents, that we see both sides of them as well.
One of the questions that came up in the book that we read at the same time, the book With Bound Hands, a Jesuit in Nazi Germany by Mary Frances Cody. One of the things that comes up at the end was the question of, why didn't more Jesuits speak up? Why didn't more orders within Catholicism speak openly against the Nazis? Why did so many remain silent, and why did so many others consent? Do you have any reading on that as to why these orders, hundreds of years old orders, who clearly, I don't know how they could, but clearly cannot reconcile their core principles, values, and ideals with the ideals of Nazism? Why did they remain quiet?
That's, as I mentioned already, the motivation was that they were frightened terribly by communism. So in spite of the fact that the church had been democratic and communistic in the beginning, and despite of the fact that we have all the orders who are communistic, they all have a vow of poverty, against poverty, and so on. So, but this secular form of communism, that is what frightened them, maybe as a competition to what they themselves wanted to do. But also that Jesus would say, you have always the poor with you, but that they wanted to do away with poverty. Why does one have to have poverty? Up to today, still people say, well, we have to be for the poor and so on. But why must there be poor? So that is a very dangerous question. We have the poor because we have the rich. So, and of course, communism is doing something about the rich and something for the poor. That at least is its teaching. So it may be some kind of a competition. When Jesus says you will have the poor always with you, then of course we have to see that in an eschatological context. That means the kingdom will come soon, and so the time in which they would be poor would be over soon. So it was a question of a situation based type of a statement. So nevertheless, that why some of them resisted, and maybe many of them resisted very often secretly. They took Jews into the monasteries, they were hiding them, which was very dangerous. It could be the death penalty. And so they did take all kinds of risks. But then on the other hand, when the Pope did not say anything, that is a big charge against Pius XII, that he did not protest or what. He was thinking of what that would mean for the Catholics in Germany and for the Catholics in other fascist countries, and he wanted to protect them. And because of that, he did not want to do more. Now, Delp himself was and that is something very important for him. He was critical not only of Nazism and authoritarianism, but also in the church. For instance, he did not want this whole diplomacy. He thought that this whole diplomatic apparatus, including, of course, the hierarchy with the eminence and all the big titles and all that, he thought that the Pope should not make big politics, but that he should follow simply the Sermon on the Mount. So that was a very harsh criticism. And when the canonization process will go on, that will come up, and it will hope it will not torpedo the whole process. So he was critical of his own order, but also of the church. And his attack was against playing in diplomacy and then always losing in the process. So as it had just happened. So therefore, Delp is of great actuality for us today.
Yeah, and he had, it seemed to me in studying that he had a peripheral connection with any assassination plot of Hitler. Even Dietrich Bonhoeffer had more of a hands-on connection to it, being with the Abwehr and making contact with others in different countries. But Delp seemed to be really on the side of it, just, not essentially to it. But he did at one point in time go to Stauffenberg's house and met with him. And I think it was to the ire of Stauffenberg that he showed up, because obviously he was being surveilled already by the Gestapo. And that connection to Stauffenberg seems to be the motivating reason why Delp was initially arrested. And he thought about it clearly in prison, the 6 months he was in prison in Tegel in Berlin, that was the reason. It was that connection to him. But then it doesn't even really come up in the trial of Freisler. I mean, Freisler's trials were mainly show trials anyways, but that connection didn't come up. And what came up more was that he was a Jesuit. Yeah. So, and it's like, again, it makes me think that, what is it about the Jesuits? And do you know, I mean, were they targeted more than other orders?
I don't think so. I think all the orders were somewhat targeted. So not only the Jesuits are very intellectual, but the Dominicans as well. So I think all the orders were under attack. It depends how far the movement went, how far the Germanic religion of blood and soil was restored. I had to learn everything about the Germanic religion. But it did not take real roots, but they made the attempt to replace Christianity by a Germanic religion. But Stauffenberg, so he went there, and that was the first suspicion. He visited Stauffenberg, so Stauffenberg had to have told him something about the assassination, and he denied that anything of that came up. And in the end, I think the Nazis accepted that he had nothing to do, much less than other religious people. So therefore, the question of tyrannicide, for instance, did not come up, which for the others played a great role. Is that not also killing when one kills the leader, and can one do that? So that question does not come up for him because he was not involved. And the Kreisauer Kreis was not involved. The Kreisauer Kreis only thought, what if the Nazi regime departs? What will we do in Germany? So, but they did not think in any case that about an assassination. Hitler had about 42 assassinations during his life. And so even the last one then failed. And he took horrible revenge for this. And for some time, our Jesuit priest was suspected, but it did not come up in the trial any longer.
Yeah, that to me, reading about the trial in front of the communist turned fascist Roland Freisler, who himself was a soldier in World War I, German soldier in World War I, and was captured by the Soviets and then eventually come home, or by the Russians, and he was in a Soviet camp, and he came home a communist, but then goes to law school during the time of the rise of the Nazis, and he becomes a fervent Nazi, and then eventually becomes the famous judge who's always screaming at everyone in front of him and insulting them, and of course he was the judge that the students and the professors of the White Rose were in front of too, and he condemned them to death. But it seemed so interesting talking about that trial, that Delp, even though he was the last of all of them to be executed, it was just a wonder as to what they were executed for. And really the Kreisau Circle, like you said, we're talking about post-Nazi Germany. What kind of government should it be? And I mean, they had already chosen someone who would be the chancellor or whatnot. I think it was the former mayor of Leipzig. But even that, to discuss the end of the 1,000-year Reich only in essentially in 12 years, that is enough to be called treasonous.
Yeah.
And that's pretty scary, because it's, we're at a point right now in our own situation where people are worried about the criminalization of basic speech, and we see this right now with students being arrested for speaking their mind on issues, and somehow being deported because they have said something that the current administration is against. And here you have the same type of thing, in Nazi Germany, where people are being arrested simply for thinking about, not even plotting, thinking about what should come after this particular regime.
Yeah. Well, that is what the Kaiser Kreis did. It was in Silesia, very close to Auschwitz, where that some kind of an estate where the Kaiser Kreis was meeting. And so not all the people of the Kaiser Kreis were executed. Most of them were, but one of them became even a president later on, of Germany, a very peaceful president. So the Nazis had preserved him for somebody. So for something, for some jobs they had for him. So yeah, so the Kaiser Kreis is very interesting, and it was indeed a crime because it seemed to show that people were not devoted to fascism, and that was already a crime in itself. So yes, the Kaiser Kreis was very interesting. They were not religious originally. It is through Jesuits like Delp that they became somehow religious and were religious in the end. But they were a secular, democratic type of a circle and movement. Yeah, very good. Yeah.
From what it sounded like, yeah, like you said, it was Delp that really introduced a more of a Christian understanding of what should come after the Nazis in Germany. And I didn't see any indication he was advocating for some kind of theocracy or some kind of expressly religious government, but at least a government that was more connected to core values and principles of Christianity, like mercy, like compassion, like solidarity, like taking care of the poor and those who are left in the ditch of history, that was the aim or one of the core constitutional aims of any just government. And it's interesting that while he's in prison and whatnot, he's reading Plato, and he's mentioned that a couple times in his letters, and and seeing what's going on in Nazi Germany through the eyes of Platonic thought and the Republic and the tyranny and the tyrannical nature of the philosopher king, but at the same time, the possibility of having an enlightenment government, a government that works for the benefit of the people through some kind of Christian understanding. So, I mean, he was deeply philosophical, deeply well read, um, and yet his idea of what German democracy would look like afterwards is certainly not what came about, I don't think. Obviously, German democracy is a lot better than Nazi authoritarianism, but it certainly wasn't a religious form of a government, especially not, let's say, well, a little more complicated between the West and the East Germany, so, I mean, what do you think there in terms of Delp's religiosity in government? Was that something that Germany would be prepared for afterwards?
Well, Delp was, of course, in the natural law position. So he shared the natural law position, which you had in the papal encyclical letters and so on. And that was the theory which was based on Aristotle, but also on Plato and so on. So, they were not against private property, but they emphasized the responsibility which you have for private property. So, in that sense, it was really open, for several sides, and unfortunately, sometimes the Nazis took care of it, made use of it as well. So, but nevertheless, it was the natural law position which he introduced into the Kreisauer Kreis, and it is a very differentiated and complicated type of a theory which separates church and state and gives the rights to the church and the rights to the state, a very balanced type of a view. If it is still of actuality today, and so that's another question, but Delps definitely thought that it was of actuality for his situation. So he was a natural lawyer.
Yeah, and it's clear in the letters and in the biography I read of him that he was a socialist. Obviously not a secular socialist, but he didn't seem to advocate for a religious form of socialism in the state. But he was a socialist. But even that, of course, um, was problematic when the National Socialists are the ruling Nazi parties, and then communism is a form of socialism, and yet he's advocating for this more of a democratic form of socialism for Germany, and one that through, like you said, the encyclical letters, or at least with the encyclical letters as influencing on his influences on his thought, a form of socialism that is deeply rooted in democracy, that allows for private property and private industry and things like this, but also is well regulated to the point where it takes care of those who are the most vulnerable people in society. And that was that very much that Christian aspect of his vision of a socialist society. So on the one hand, he has the secularization of Christianity into socialism, and then he maintains the religious social teachings of Catholicism, of Christianity, of Jesus of Nazareth as well.
I, I don't know if one can call him a socialist, really. He allows poverty, private poverty and even poverty of corporations and so on. The emphasis is rather, you have a tremendous responsibility when you have poverty of this, and so you have to look for social justice. That was his emphasis, but he allows private property and presumes that people can be ethical enough to have big poverty and deal with it in a social way. and sharing it with the poor to some extent. So, but I think to call him a socialist would go too far, because of his allowing for private property, not only of normal individuals, but particularly the private property of big corporations.
Yeah, do you know why the University of Munich rejected his candidacy for the PhD program there in philosophy?
Yeah, I don't know really, but it must have been because of the Jesuit order. So the White Rose was active in the University of Munich. So it was obviously one which had become fascist, National Socialist, and so they did not allow for this. So, um, but probably not only because he was a Jesuit, maybe they didn't want to have any priests or whatever in their university. That is why he was rejected there. Yeah.
And so the University of Munich obviously was secular, but at the same time, did it go through, the Nazification like everything else did, like all the rest of the universities?
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
And so to have a Jesuit possibly, at least connected with Jesuits in the tradition of really not falling in line with the Nazis. I mean, that's what I was suspected when I read that he was denied. It probably had something to do with the Jesuits, right?
Yeah. Jesuits, and it may be orders in general, and it may be church people in general. I don't know how far that went. So, University of Frankfurt became very fast Nazified in 1933. So others maybe not so much. And there was some resistance in all universities, but it was very fast. It was repressed. So my doctor father, Joseph Lorz, who was a Nazi, he kept his job in the University of Münster throughout the war, and while all the others, professors of theology, were fired. So it was, if if you were a priest like Lorz and you joined them, then you were protected. So for them, your attitude toward National Socialism was the important issue. Later on, Lord said, well, he was cheated and he was misinformed and whatever. But so um, this was divided. The church was divided. There was resistance. And I think we should take that resistance serious, the Protestant one and the Catholic one as well. And it is not fair to, when I was a prisoner of war here and I came 1945, there were still people who were thinking that all Germans were Nazis. And then it was the Frankfurt School which informed Mrs. Roosevelt that there may be some anti-Nazis even in Germany and among the prisoners. So they had 300,000 German prisoners here and 100,000 Italian prisoners from the Afrika Korps. And so they then suddenly found people, prisoners who were not Nazis, and they established a program where they trained people to go back to Germany and to denazify and to democratize, and I was one of them.
How did the churches, the German church, the Catholic Church, the Protestant Church, predominantly Lutherans, were they denazified? I mean, because obviously, you have what was called Gleichschaltung, the synchronization, the Nazification essentially of society, of media and culture and education, and everything had to somehow come in line with the Nazi ideology. And in many cases, much of the churches did that too. So after the war, was part of the democratization of the church also, or of Germany, the democratization, or at least the denazification of the churches?
Well, the denazification was very different in East Germany and in West Germany. In East Germany, it was very radically pursued for many years. In West Germany, after the Nuremberg trial, the Allies wanted to get the German population on their side. And therefore, they very soon after Nuremberg trial, they stopped the denazification. My uncle, for instance, was a judge and a Nazi in East Germany, and he was punished severely for having been a National Socialist. He had to work in a mine, Kali mine, for several years, and then he fled one night, fled over to West Germany, and there he was right away restored, got his pension back, got a new job, and so on. So um, it was in West Germany many Nazis suddenly turned into liberals, and but without real deeper conversion, I think. And so all the old positions were retaken again by former Nazis who now posed as liberals. Not always, of course, but in many cases. So, and my uncle is a good example there. He was a judge in a town where in Geyser, where a synagogue was right beside his castle where he lived. The synagogue was burned down. The Jewish people who lived around there were taken away to concentration camps. A German officer beat up a Polish prisoner because he had fallen in love with a German girl, and he cut their hairs and dragged them from one village to the other and so on. And he came into our restaurant. We have a restaurant there with bloody hands and said, "This is Polish blood." And my uncle did not interfere at all. So I think a small judge as we have it today would have a hard time to resist. But I don't know, if he would have resisted if it had not been so dangerous because of his Nazi inclinations. He liked the Nazi laws for agriculture and several other things, the relationship to nature in Nazism, the emphasis on strength and the authoritarian type of personality. So one has to look at a very different, differentiated view of all these things because the propaganda is always one-sided.
So I was just recently listening to a podcast by Louis DeCaro Jr., who's an excellent scholar on the American abolitionist John Brown. And his latest podcast said that in America, we will celebrate someone like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, deeply religious, anti-Nazi, lost his life in the struggle against the Nazis and what they were doing, especially to the Jews. And we as Americans will celebrate him because he's over there, and we won't do the same for someone like John Brown. In fact, most Americans don't even know who John Brown was. He was a deeply religious Calvinist, fought against slavery, and of course lost his life in the cause, just in many ways like Dietrich Bonhoeffer. But Bonhoeffer is well known now, at least, and he's increasingly becoming well known in America. So much to the point he's probably more known than John Brown. But Alfred Delp is not known very well in the United States, at least. Obviously, like I said in my opening monologue, he's much more well known in Germany with lots of streets and churches named after him, things like this. But why do you think Delp is less known in the West than Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Is it because Delp hasn't been appropriated in many cases by conservatives or by the far right, the same way that Bonhoeffer has, I think mistakenly, but nevertheless, they have done that. Is that one of the reasons?
Well, the whole thing was in West Germany. I grew up in West Germany. I lived in West Germany then. They were just quiet about the whole thing. So nobody knew that Lords had been a Nazi. The bishop then decorated him a little bit, gave him some position, but it was very quiet, and nobody mentioned that my teacher Lords was a Nazi. So I was fascinated by him because he had written the most adequate Luther book in Catholicism. that Luther did not make the Reformation, but that it came about because of the bad condition of Catholicism, which was responsible for it all. And that was very, very progressive view. So I found out only later on when I discussed with him with my dissertation, the war, the farmer war, and so on. And so we found that we were very different in our position. And I slowly found out that he was a Nazi. So, and I separated from him and found a new doctor father. So that, that is the whole situation, that in West Germany, people did not want to face the issue. They had the Marshall Plan. They concentrated on economics. They did an economic miracle, which now is coming to an end. So, and so that is maybe the reason why they why they are less known. One of my relatives, Persege, was the judge in the Auschwitz trial in Frankfurt in the 70s, and he got gray hairs in a very short time because of the witnesses about the concentration camps, but then also because the Germans put him under pressure and say, you should not sit in judgment about the Nazis there because they only did their duty. They only did their duty, and so on. So, and for the rest of his life, he suffered tremendously from sitting in judgment about the Auschwitz people. SS people and so on. So I think it has something to do with that, with the attempt to rescue Germany and the rest of Europe from takeover of by socialism and communism. And the danger was very great because all of Europe was in ruins, and people were very much inclined to maybe toward a socialistic solution, but that was prevented then.
Yeah. So for our last question, because we're running out of time here, for a lot of people, our discussion on Delp is going to be the first time they've heard about it. I've scoured, YouTube, watching all the videos about Delp, and there's very little about him. What would you like to see? Would you like to see some kind of, a different kind of look at his legacy, a more reading of his letters and the works that he's written? I mean, he even wrote about Heidegger, for instance. He wrote a book on Heidegger's work. We had for me when I was studying, it was the first time I'm reading about Delp and his work that he's done. So what would you like to see for his legacy or in his canonization and things like this?
Well, I would like that people would, get a book or two about him, by him, in order to at least to see what his stand was. To what extent this is of actuality today, that's another question. So, but I think we can learn from his fortitude and, of course, his unbelievable struggle in prison concerning God and God's help. He wanted to live all the time in prison, and he wanted to get out of it and so on. And he tried everything to get out, and he never knew from day to day what would happen. And so it was an unbelievable struggle which the man had up to the end. And finally, he died one day before Freisler died. And Freisler, by the way, who was then in the ruins dying, and it was a Protestant nurse whose brother he had sentenced to death, who took care in his last hours and so on. So this unbelievable monstrosity of a judge. So if he was ever reconciled with his fate is another question. So it was a struggle with God in a certain sense, and a struggle for trusting God in spite of all the horrible things which happened to the very end.
I got the same impression reading his letters, his prison letters. This was a man who wanted to live.
Yeah,
This was a man who felt he had something to do in this world. Um, and over the course of those 6 months, slowly resigned himself to knowing that he was going to die, he was going to be executed, but also knowing somehow towards the end that he was being executed for a reason because he had put, as you said, he put God in the complete dependence on God back into the center of his faith, and therefore he died knowing it was for a reason. Even if this was a man who he seemed to be just in love with living,
exactly. Yeah,
but knew that he was going for a reason. So absolutely amazing story. I really hope people, like you said, get a couple books on Delp, read his letters, his biography. It's very fascinating, courageous individual. And as you said, it takes a whole lot of courage to mount some kind of opposition to a regime like the Nazis.
yeah, it's right.
So, Dr. Siebert, it's been a wonderful discourse. I'm happy we could do this again, and I hope other people will enjoy our discourse and learn something from it and inspire them to do their own studies on Father Alfred Delp. And I think our next discourse is going to be about another Jesuit, in this case, Pope Francis.
Yes, that is a wonderful choice.
Absolutely.